Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. My guest today is Professor Torbjorn Netland. He is the chair of Production and Operations Management in the Department of Management, Technology, and Economics at ETH Zurich in Switzerland. He is member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Advanced Manufacturing and Value Chains, and he's a fellow of the European Academy for Industrial Management. Tor's award-winning research on managing performance improvement has appeared in leading scientific journals, including, just to name a few, Management Science, MIT Sloan Management Review, and the Journal of Operations Management. Tor is a recognized thought leader in operational excellence and in methods including Lean. He's the recipient of 2 Shingo Research Awards and numerous teaching awards. So you can find his blog, and I'll link to this in the show notes, at www.better-operations.com. So Tor, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Thanks, Mark. It's a great honor to be invited by you to speak with you today about Lean and whatever else you have in mind.
Yeah, exactly. We'll talk about Lean and whatever else, mostly Lean, but I think there's a lot of interesting manufacturing topics to discuss. And before we get into that, I just want to mention that Tor, like another recent guest, Dr. Lisa Yerian, who joined me again in episode 449, Tor is going to be one of the keynote speakers at the upcoming AME Annual Conference. It's being held in Dallas, October 17th to 20th. So I hope to see you there. I'll be there. Tor will be there on stage. You're speaking in person, right?
That's true. I look forward to go to Dallas. Never been there before. Yeah. And meet the community. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, because and part of why I asked her is just confirm that it's a bit of a hybrid event. There'll be a lot of people there in person, and some speakers are appearing virtually. So I'm glad you'll be able to make the trip from Zurich. So you can learn more about the conference at ame.org, or you can look for a link in the show notes. So the theme for the event this year is embrace disruption. So Tor, maybe my first question for you is to share a little bit about the topic, the themes of your keynote talk, and how it fits into the idea of embrace disruption.
I thought I will talk a little bit about the role of new technologies in lean transformation, which is maybe shaking up a little bit the lean community, at least all those pen and paper consultants and lovers out there. We're going to try to see if there is a role for technology in Lean, and clearly there is, and then give a few examples of where technologies can help us close the gap and increase productivity beyond what Lean can do alone.
Yeah, and you're right. Discussion of that will fire the neurons of people in the audience in different ways. There are some, I'm trying to think of old guard. I don't know if I said it. There are some who really hold to the idea, I think, as you alluded to, that you must do everything with paper and pencil, whether that's an A3 or a Kaizen card for documenting an improvement, or a value stream map, or things like that. But and let's say in Jeffrey Liker's book, The Toyota Way, he emphasizes how Toyota doesn't completely shy away from technology. Maybe they just don't take it to an extreme of using technology for technology's sake. Do you think that's fair to say?
That's exactly what it is. If you look at Toyota, all these tools that we worship in the Lean community are really nothing else than tools. They can be replaced with other tools. Mm-hmm. It's the thing we're trying to achieve that matters, right? Which is increased productivity, better work environment, customers that are happier with our products and want to buy more. So I'm trying to stay on a outcome-focused transformation rather than the tools and practices. Yeah. And then suddenly technology can actually do things we could never do with pen and paper. So we should have an open eye for these things, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, I think one simple example that I even saw over 20 years ago would be the idea of taking a simple Kanban card, right? So maybe in its origin, piece of paper, maybe it's laminated, maybe it has some plastic technology to help protect the card. But traditionally that Kanban card or container might physically travel back to a supplier as the signal But even 20 years ago, we saw companies using fax, which seems like an outdated technology now, or internet technologies to communicate. What seems important is that information that you're sending to the supplier, not how you do it, right?
Absolutely. No, e-Kanban we had in the 90s. You're right.
Yeah,
And we tend to forget these things. So when people are very skeptical towards the new digital technologies, just ask them if they use email.
Mm-hmm. Some of them might say no. But,
yeah, sure. Maybe
but most people do. Yeah.
So that's of course we're going to try to give a few. I'm going to try to give a few more practical examples as well. It's not just about sure, technologies can help. Hopefully, I get into one of the examples I plan to talk about is quality management. For years we've used Pokayokes to try to avoid mistakes happening. Still, mistakes happen. For 100 years, we use statistical process control, still taught widely in schools, completely outdated in some sense, at least in some type of manufacturing environments. But it's still the go-to tool for many lean consultants and practitioners. And here, for example, the latest machine learning algorithms can do wonders if they are applied correctly to systems where data exists in a form that can be used. So, I mean, I'm not saying it's easy, but it is possible to do things better than it was 100 years ago.
Yeah. Or even better than 10 years ago in a lot of cases. And I'd love to hear more if you can kind of elaborate on this idea of, in some cases, is there something better than SPC for, let's say, looking at manufacturing dimensions on some sort of part that you're cutting. This is what I was involved in, over 25 years ago. You have specifications, you have a centerline target, and you're monitoring the SPC chart to decide when you might shut down a process to investigate, not because it's gone out of spec, but you see some sort of signal that says, okay, that hole, it's getting to be too small. The variation is too high. Let's stop and adjust. Can you talk about how AI or machine learning might monitor a process in a way that's better?
So SPC works in many of these environments. It's a tool that is still not used enough, if you'd like. But in manufacturing environments where one parameter setting can affect another one, which you may probably have in the tooling industry. You change a tool to another one, and suddenly the heat and friction between the tool changes as well. I mean, there are dependencies. So as long as you only use SPC and you're focusing on one variable, you may improve that. You may optimize the process for a variable that overall hurts the system. The industry where we've been working in this is extreme in that regard. It's the semiconductor industry. It's one where you actually would not necessarily like to go into with an SPC tool in the first place, because there's so many variables that affect the outcome of the process. And maybe one of the most difficult things there is that you don't really learn the outcome of the process before it's gone through 200 to 300, 400 processes.
Right.
That may be different in a tool shop where after you grinded it, you milled it, you can actually inspect the product and see is it within specs. In electronics manufacturing and semiconductor in particular, this is much harder because the parts and they affect each other, and maybe you need to do this process before you can test it and so on. And then suddenly you will have more complex production systems with many variables that affect each other's. Then SPC, which basically just picks up one variable, it's not bad. It's better than nothing, but it doesn't really solve the problem. So with machine learning, you just throw all of these things into a neural network as long as you have an outcome variable that makes sense. In semiconductor industry, it's yield, right? So number of defects produced, a good products to defects. And then you just look at all the parameters you have in your production process, and the algorithm can provide advice to the engineer or operator where the likely mistakes are happening, what we should change. Impossible with SPC unless you have a lot of. This is just one example, and of course, in a very high-tech industry, which is mature, which have a lot of data, highly automated. And then as we move towards the less automated, more manual assembly work and these type of things, well, it's within this span, we will try to figure out what technology works best. So I'm not saying it's always machine learning. No, SPC is a wonderful tool in the right circumstances, but it's not all that there is.
Yeah. So yeah, when I hear about these new technologies, I personally feel a little bit disrupted. There are times when I'm disruptive, but here I feel disrupted because I feel like I understand SPC, I know how and where to apply it. And so, it's a little bit frightening to learn about some of the, or to think, how do we learn about these new technologies? How do we bring them into our organization in a way that's not too scary or not too threatening for people? Like, I'd be curious if you can kind of, share an example, whether that's with a company in Europe or, just even a broader question of like, introducing new methods, whether it's lean methods or whether it's technologies. What are some things you've learned about introducing new things to people?
The first, admire your reaction. I mean, you open, you say, I don't know all the thing about this. I need to learn more, or you get frightened. My lean foundation is shaking a little bit, and that's of course that's the right reaction, because then I'm open to try to figure out what can this be. First realization: nobody in the world knows everything you need to improve manufacturing today. There's not one single person who knows everything about machine learning, 3D printing, IoT, and all of these things. So first realization is we need to work together, right? We need to be a team. We need to listen to each other. We need to be open for ideas. We need to work with other type of companies, startups, maybe universities, take in students, and here's the advantage for lean companies. They have this attitude, right? The Kaizen, we want to learn, we want to improve, we're open for not being the best. And so that was my experience visiting companies in Japan. Although back in that time I was only a student, I came to the factory and there's like 20 senior managers lined up in front of the factory to visit us, or to welcome a student from, I never had that in the US, in Scandinavia, in Europe, nowhere. But I have this attitude of, maybe we can learn something today.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess your question was more, how do we start to engage with these new technologies? How do we overcome the resistance?
What have you learned about introducing? I mean, as a professor, you're introducing new concepts to people all the time. Maybe it's students have this expectation of, I'm a student, I'm here to learn. You raise, I think, an interesting point of sometimes people who are further along in their career don't have that same learning mindset or growth mindset. They say, well, I've learned it, I've been doing it, I know things. So there's a couple different ways of framing the question, maybe. But as somebody who introduces new concepts to people, what are some things you've learned about how to do that most effectively?
In my experience, first of all, it's worth listening to those who have done these things forever. You need them. That's the guys who are going to continue to do this. So I take my strategy to this from Murimura Muda, from classic lean. Why do I say that? When I was working with Volvo back in the days, studying how they try to just deploy, should say, or do a lean transformation, you have the same issues. I mean, it can be technology, but it can also be a soft technology like lean, new processes, new ways of doing things. It's frightening anyway, right? You need to change a little bit. And the best way to go about that is to start with reducing overload for those who are supposed to do this, right, Moody? And that basically means helping the operator. The first thing you should do is to make sure you introduce technology or lean principles and practices that actually makes life easier on the shop floor.
Yes.
That's the best way. Then you win them and you can move on. Few companies get this, and they start with waste, right? Start with Muda. Okay, let's reduce waste. Let's take away these time thieves. Away with that coffee break. You lost them immediately. It's from one of the learnings from the Volvo, and I think it's exactly the same for new technologies. Need to look at for technologies that augment and help the operators succeed in their jobs, rather than just think let's automate them away. So I think that's my answer to that one. Classic Murimura Muda.
Yeah, and like you said, make sure you're being helpful. Throwing a solution at people that doesn't address something that they think is a problem, people will ignore that solution. If we don't get agreement that there's a problem, or even if they would say there's not a problem, if we can make people's work easier, less frustrating, that at least helps. People are complicated. We could say rationally, yeah, I know that new way of doing it is better, but I'm comfortable doing it the old way, right? So we still have to work people through it. But I agree with you, like making sure that there's benefit to people is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, I agree. And there are still many, we call dull, dirty, and dangerous jobs in manufacturing, and automating these jobs or semi-automating these jobs so it's get less of this and more of other jobs is also a good place to start. Yes, so there's plenty of opportunity for new technology, which lean can't solve everything. It's right. There's space for many type of solutions.
Yes. So on the topic of automation, I wanted to ask you your thoughts. And instead of looking at replacing a tool or making incremental change, sometimes people have this vision of might call it total automation, or even going back to the 1980s. Roger Smith famously was the CEO of General Motors, and he had this vision of a lights out factory, and they spent billions and billions of dollars pursuing this vision that just didn't really go very far. And in more recent years, Elon Musk, as CEO of Tesla, has pursued the similar idea of the machine that builds the machines, I think is how he called it. So this dream of a lights out factory, is that still a dream? Is it a nightmare? Is it somewhere in between?
It's still a dream. It's a wet dream, even for some people. Yeah. And by some people, I mean engineers. And we have to, of course, give them engineers respect. They're the guys who build this world in many ways, right? At least the things we use. And that vision is still very much alive. And in itself, I don't have a problem with the vision. I mean, if we can make technology work for humans, make things we need, it's a good vision. Of course, there's a very strong capitalistic motive there as well. If you can make a factory that just produces things and sell, it's a wonderful thing. So it's also a wet dream for many business people. And now, of course, reality hits in when you try to do these things, and then suddenly Mother Nature has its requirements, physics has its requirement, and most importantly, human behaviors, markets, disruptions, all of these things just makes it very, very difficult. And it's not new. I mean, I think one book called Automation that was published in 1950, it was about how the factories will be fully automated within a few years. Just a few years later, of course, we also got the computer integrated manufacturing revolution in the 70s and 80s. Lots of good thoughts, same vision. And you mentioned the General Motors story with robots started to painting other robots and welding the door shuts. It's not easy, right? You need such a control, which is almost out of the world, and maybe not necessary. What I'd say is the vision is still alive, and I don't think it is a bad vision to have, but expecting that it will be just around the corner is probably for someone who hasn't studied history. Yeah. So I would say at least towards that vision, let's rather see how we can augment humans to do work better, and then at the end of the day, if we can automate some of these tasks, that may actually be progress for the world.
Yeah, and there's a difference. I mean, General Motors had this long history of a combative relationship with its workforce in the union. When I was working there in the mid-90s, you could definitely sense that you were part of kind of the aftermath. That wasn't history. That was still very much the case. And it seemed like the mindset of General Motors was one of looking at, people are a problem, so let's try to get rid of them, which is different than the Toyota mindset that you've mentioned of, if a job is dangerous, unsafe, boring, too repetitive, or if it could be done better by a robot, let's automate it.
Sure.
As opposed to just I don't know Elon Musk's mindset. I think he's a technologist who falls in love with technology. But as he commented publicly after they struggled, automating some things that maybe were a bit of an overreach. He famously said he learned people are underrated.
Yes,
there are some jobs people still can do better.
No, this is true. It's because, as you said, excessive automation was a mistake, my mistake, or something in that famous tweet. But of course, these factories are still quite automated, and also when they open new factories now, they do seek automation where it's possible. So it just maybe he went too far, and it's not just Tesla; it's also the other car manufacturers. I was at Mercedes in Stuttgart, and they had the same. They had even for the final assembly, of course, assembling seats and these things is a very difficult thing, which humans still do. They had our robots for that, but then suddenly market demand changes, more variation, more different types of products, perhaps on the same line. And then they realized as well, human is the most flexible, cost-efficient robot there is on the world, kind of. So they changed it as well. Yeah, back and forth, but every time, maybe it's 2 steps ahead and 1 step back. Yeah.
Well, we learn and adjust, hopefully. So that there's evidence to that. So Tor, I want to step back a little bit. This is a question I like to ask my guests, and I often do it at the beginning of the podcast, but I'll go ahead and throw the question in here. Like, what sparked your interest in topics like lean and operational excellence?
It's a good question. Let me maybe answer that question with how I got to start to study and do research on lean and lean programs. I was working with Volvo Aero at that point in time. Today it's part of GKN, a British multinational, producing part for engines, aerospace aircraft engines. I was visiting this factory, working with them on a project, and suddenly kind of the door went up, and it was a pallet was just pulled into the factory full of books, and on the book it said Volvo Production System. That was the delivery from the headquarters in Sweden, and the message that came with the pallet of books was clear: go implement. Here you are, here's our system, good luck. And that was, of course, an interesting observation, and obviously also not how you should do it, but it sparked my interest for these things, having already worked in manufacturing and research for some years at that point in time. I found that to be particularly interesting.
No. And so then how did you decide to pursue this then, more deeply as a research focus, as a career focus?
So, of course, what I observed was what I have later learned to call a phenomenon. I mean, it's an observation. There's something that is happening here. Okay, this was a lean transformation under the label of Volvo Production System, something I call the company-specific production system, something that many companies have, even as you would know for sure, hospitals with Virginia Mason production system and all these variants, Ford production system and so on. Yeah. They started to study this phenomenon and basically with two angles. First, does this make sense? It means does it improve operational performance? And second, if it does, how do you do it most efficiently so you actually can achieve those performance benefits as fast as possible? The answer to the first question is yes, it does improve operational performance if you do it right? Particularly in the industry that I studied, which was automobile industry. And basically then how do you study this is the next question for a researcher. And what I knew is that I can't sit in my office, and this was back in the days, it was in Trondheim, Norway. I can't just sit there in an office and try to figure this thing out. You need to go and visit. So I started to travel together with with a mentor from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I started to travel the world and visit Volvo factories, and visited 54 Volvo factories at the end of the day on all continents, met with people on the shop floor, on management positions, and interviewed them. And then parallel to that, collecting Volvo Production System assessment data, which would be familiar, I would assume, to many of your listeners, this type of audits that companies often run in lean transformations, in addition to KPI data and the survey data. So And from this, I did my doctoral studies back in the day, which was for me a tremendous learning opportunity, just traveling the world and learning from Volvo, a very good company.
Yeah. So I was learning from Volvo, and you mentioned going to Japan. Tell us a little bit more about that trip or trips and the value of doing that.
So at that point in time, I visited mostly, of course, some Scandinavian factories in the Volvo Group, but also mostly American factories, which are good in their own way. Okay, interesting in their own way, and the cultures are different and these things. But then I went to US. I didn't know to Japan. I didn't know what to expect. And as I said, the level of formality but also preparations that came from their side was at another level, absolutely different level. And then when I first came there, there stood 10 senior managers outside the factory lined up to welcome me. At that point in time, a doctoral student, to the factory to show me around. And in the end of the day, they asked me, so what have you seen? What can we learn? And for me, first of all, at that point in time, I couldn't teach them anything, but I definitely learned a lot. So it was just a remarkable experience. And then what else should I say? I worked with, of course, it's called UD Trucks. It's owned by a Volvo Group now. It was part of Nissan Diesel before. And I saw truck manufacturing in Japan. Whether or not this can be compared to Toyota, I don't know. But it was clearly impressive. The first time you see this in a Japanese automobile factory, maybe. I was just standing a floor above the shop floor, and it was like observing a dance. It was It was different. I never seen that in any other assembly factory in Europe or US. It was a coordinated dance of movements just in time to the line, flying carpets. I don't know how to describe it. It was
I think I've used that same language, that the work is so well designed, it seems choreographed. The interaction between individuals in the work, between different individuals. I love a factory tour, like when I've been able to go to Japan and you can walk up on that catwalk level and really both stand and look down to see the work. That's different than a tour where they drive you through on a tram, and you don't really ever stop. And like to watch cycles of work, whether it's an assembly line at Toyota, of seeing how things are synchronized, or I think even more rare and more exciting to see is like a U-shaped cell, where the work is again like so well designed. It's really it's beautiful to see.
Absolutely. So that was my experience as well on the mezzanine there. You could see the dance, and then afterwards you go to the engine factory right next door, and you learn it's a 2-hour buffer between them, and you understand also the fragility or the robustness of the system. There's not much. It's not much to play with. This has to work, or everything stops.
Well, then you see even something like a 2-hour buffer. Or even if you go to, let's say, a Toyota plant in the United States, the assembly line is in segments and there are buffers in between those segments where assembly kind of moves back and forth. And I guess a question for you is helping people see past dogma of like, zero inventory. Well, Toyota doesn't have zero inventory. Or dogma of like, inspection is waste, get rid of inspection. Well, Toyota still has final inspection. Because I'm curious to hear your thoughts on like some of these things that might be directional, but sometimes maybe people take it to an extreme before they're really capable of that.
These are very interesting observations, and clearly also where we've gone wrong to some extent. But I would first maybe start to say that although we say these things, it's often repeated in the lean community that we should have stockless production and no inspection. The fact is that there are very, very few companies in the world that ever had that. So you can't blame that for things doesn't work, because companies actually don't have it. But absolutely, when you look at inspection, this is where I'm thinking about that you have to tailor this thing we call lean to the context you're talking about. So if you go into an electronics manufacturer today, every second step is either testing or inspection, and you won't make way of it because the customer is actually interested in paying off for exactly that. The inspection is the service. You could also do this at home and don't have it tested and inspected, but then you have no guarantee it would work. So
yeah.
There's actually value add to inspection and testing. Same with inventory to some extent, because you know there's a value add to having the product available when you want it. It's the value of availability. And these buffer inventories actually may help reduce the lead time to your door or the availability when you need it. This is a discussion we really never had in the lean community, and it's misunderstood. And we're talking about the 7 wastes and stockless production, and we're stuck there.
Yeah, I mean, I think things like you know, the inspection, inventory, like, to me, that some of that facilitates an outcome. Like what the customer, I think, is paying for is, you know, the right quality product and the right quantity delivered at the right time. And there might be ways of delivering that are least wasteful than others, right? So having some inventory might be less wasteful than not being able to make delivery to your customer because you have an imperfect, unreliable process. Or inspection, you know, it seems like if, like you said, if somebody could guarantee that they were building a perfect product as complex as a car, I'm sure they would gladly do away with the inspection. But it seems like having the inspection, again, like, to me, is least wasteful than delivering bad products that have to be fixed later.
No, that's absolutely correct. Yeah, we cover these things, by the way, in our upcoming textbook, Mark. So
okay. We'll talk about the textbook. Yeah.
But particularly the inspection thing is something that is undervalued in manufacturing, and there are ways to go about it that are better than others. But the idea that it should be completely removed is probably not feasible.
Yeah. But, you know, so you talk about, you know, these different views. So I want to dig a little deeper into, like, some people would say, well, lean means zero inventory. I'm like, well, okay, we might define it differently. You've blogged about this, and I'll link to the blog post that points to a journal article around, you know, confusion on, you know, what is lean. And I kind of want to explore 2 parts to this. Like, one is different views amongst academics and researchers, and then maybe, you know, out in industry or in healthcare. But, like, we've already alluded to a couple of them, but what's the most common confusion, or at least another common thing that people are maybe confused about, or maybe we might even use the word wrong?
Okay, so this what's lean depends on where you are, kind of, and what you've seen, and there's so many different opinions, right? And now maybe you and I, we would like to think we've studied this for a long time. We know what it is. At least we know maybe more than average what it is, and maybe that's true. But in the end, at the same time, we have our views and others have other views. That's the first realization we have to make. So when I was traveling the factories, sometimes I met many people on the shop floor that may not have heard the lean, maybe heard it but forgot it. And it can also be, of course, the company-specific production systems. They heard it or seen it, but they don't know what it is. And often they would even define it as yellow tape on the floor. 5S, lean is cleaning. Okay, that's for some people, that's how they see it. Now, that's not how maybe most students and engineers will see it, because at least they had some class on this in school or something, they read a book, and they will maybe see it as waste reduction. And that's maybe the most common way of looking at lean. And it is maybe a common denominator across all these areas where we apply lean, because there's always waste, and it's a good thing to reduce it. It's fine. It's correct. It's just that there is more to it. And if you only thing you do is to reduce waste, you actually hurt other areas that are important for performance.
Yeah.
And that's where I often come back to this Muri Mura Muda, which is
Right.
for me almost like a theory of lean, because it contains an understanding of reducing overload, reducing variety, and then reducing waste. So that's a better approach. It's a high level thinking.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I think sometimes it's important to try to separate different experiences, different opinions versus, correct and incorrect, and there might be degrees of correctness. So it's not just a yes, no, right, wrong thing. But you often read. There are some academics and there are publications. These often come from fields in the social sciences or labor relations, articles that will go on and on about how lean is bad for workers. And it's based on some people's lived experiences. But the trouble I have is then when they generalize and say, well, these people had bad experiences in this organization, therefore lean is bad. I'm like, well, that's hard. That causes some difficulties or confusion.
Absolutely, but this is again, this is also a little bit understanding there's about how research works, right? And there's limitations to research as well. Mm-hmm. And in many of these studies, and also in many consulting practices, lean is a label you use to sell a service. Whatever you can sell within this, that at least theoretically you'd like to increase productivity or something in the factory, but you may end up just doing something under the label of lean because people want that. Of course, we do have that in research as well, because you need to tie your research finding or something to something that has practical value that people are actually interested in. And lean is helpful in this sense because it is a phenomenon of great interest in industry. In research, it's also like this: if you can tie to something that others say is working and you can prove it doesn't work, suddenly it sounds more interesting than it may actually be, because your observation is, of course, correct.
Yeah, there's a difference between saying, I mean, we could come at it either way, that an organization tried to, quote unquote, implement lean, whatever that meant to them, didn't really lead to business benefit. The employees were all upset. The company gave up on it. And to say, lean didn't work there, it's hard to extrapolate. Just as it would be hard to extrapolate, let's say, look at a company like Danaher. Like, well, Danaher is a manufacturer, acquires companies, puts them through lean transformation, creates a lot of value, creates a lot of benefit to all their stakeholders. That doesn't mean everyone's going to be a Danaher either. Like, so what do we learn from the problems and what do we learn from the successes? That's what we have to figure out for, let's say, as you frame it, our company's production system, right?
I think it's a much better approach because for numerous reasons. The lean is many things to many different people, and it depends on your experience and this. So when you, for example, talk about that company that some maybe organizational behavior researchers studied, and they find they were doing lean, they observed it, right? That's a phenomenon. Somebody tried to do some 5S and daily shop floor meetings and stuff. Whether or not it worked and was implemented as or used as it should be, it's of less interest. It's a phenomenon. Lean under this, certain things happen, cause relationship and so on, and they go. So from their perspective, it's not wrong, right?
Yeah.
But if we look at this from the maybe. And that's when it becomes tricky. When we look at it from the lean as TPS angle, and we look at the respect for people and using daily shop floor meeting properly in this, that's absolutely not lean. And then the question is, okay, so is lean Toyota production system? And some people say lean is TPS applied outside of Toyota. It's a fair definition, but I think it has many problems. Because I don't think, for example, and you're the expert, but when you apply lean in a hospital, it's not TPS outside of a car factory. It has completely different settings. It's the customer is not the customer, the patient is not the customer, and so on and so on. So that's where I think the company-specific production system tailoring the lean, if you'd like, or even if you want to go there, Six Sigma, total quality management, whatever works for you to achieve the purpose you want to do, which is often improving productivity. Pack it into your own system, just like Toyota did. That's what they did.
Yeah. I mean, I think we in healthcare, we can certainly learn principles and mindsets and practices from Toyota. Do we call it TPS? We probably wouldn't call it TPS. We probably wouldn't call it. I wouldn't call it production, right? So you mentioned earlier this one label, Virginia Mason production system. Like, as successful as Virginia Mason has been over 15 plus years, I've always found that a bit curious that they didn't call it, let's say, the Virginia Mason Care system. Or, there are other organizations that might say, well, we've adapted lean and TPS and we call it the Cleveland Clinic Improvement Model, or we call it continuous improvement, or some other label. So Cleveland Clinic Improvement Model is Cleveland Clinic's description of their system. And I think there is benefit to that, right? I mean, General Motors didn't want to say we're implementing Toyota production system. They want to call it, global competitive manufacturing or something. They give it their own label.
No, I think of course, there's a value because of the ownership you get to the model. Of course, nobody in the automobile industry want to implement the competitor's model. This is maybe also partly why they call it lean back in the days, but that's too generic, right? So labeling it by your own name, maybe even using your logo, your colors, it creates some ownership. There's no doubt that this belongs to you. And that comes with a few benefits. First, it makes it clear that, this is not optional. This is a system that we have developed and want to use. And second, it should also create a little bit this more long-term commitment to the model. So, when the CEO change, new model, but particularly if you use Six Sigma for a long time, then we try lean, and you get all these consultants cross-firing at you and trying to win you over for the next big thing, Industry 4.0, Industry 5.0. If these things happen in any case, if you can say, fine, but let's build it into our company-specific production system, business system, or whatever you want to call it, I think it's a stronger, more sustainable approach.
Yeah. There's that ownership, and there's the ability to evolve. So, like, just to use another example of an organization and their label, Duke University Health System has what they call the Duke Quality System. When you call it something kind of broad like that, you can fold in and incorporate different methodologies where it doesn't seem like we're giving up on this and now this is our thing. Like, you could fold in maybe a little bit of Six Sigma with lean and other safety and quality practices. It's Duke's quality system. And one other benefit maybe, and you wrote about this, so I wanted to ask you about lean versus TPS. It's funny, you wrote in the blog post, if you like heated debates, start a discussion thread on the definition of lean on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I think try that, Mark.
I've seen enough of that. But I think the other heated debate is one that I see a lot of people, back to this question of lean is just a label for TPS versus lean is a low definition, low fidelity copy. Let me try to say that again. A low fidelity copy of TPS, or it could be better than TPS, where we've taken it. I think you or somebody in the article said, are we trying to copy Toyota of the 1960s, or are we trying to evolve our own company operating system?
Absolutely. I mean, this is, when I go to conferences, you still see this Taichi Ono photo on the shop floor, right? Maybe we're also guilty in using it at some point in time. And, Taichi Ono said, and he's on the shop floor on the 70s, come on, this isn't state of the art. And we know, and whatever he said back then was probably truth and all of these things, but it isn't universal truth, and the world changed. so when the world evolves, also Toyota evolves, right?
Right.
So Toyota develops the Toyota production system. We talked about that. We saw in France now in the Toyota factory, they have an industry 4.0 manager in Toyota factory. But that's it. That's an interesting observation. So it's something that happens. And it basically just shows that Toyota at least is willing to learn and develop. Maybe we should try to ask someone to define what is the Toyota production system anno 2022. And if what they still show is the TPS house, which is a very good description of how it was. If that's where we still are, we're losing out on a lot of opportunities with new technologies, with a new world, with geopolitical tensions and all kind of things that we have.
And we can look and see how Toyota, on their corporate Japan website in English, how they define the Toyota production system today, right? What?
That's two things they have on that web page: is Jidoka and just in time, right? I mean, at least that's what that's it.
Right, and then there's a lot more to it. But let's say if you visit, one of the visitor centers in, let's say, San Antonio or in Japan, when they have, displays explaining, here's what we mean by respect for people. Here's what we mean by continuous improvement. Like, there are those other dimensions to it. We can look at how, TSSC teaches TPS to different types of organizations here in 2022, how they explain it. And I think you raise a good point. There are some notions that might be outdated, and Toyota has evolved. Like the one I've heard from Toyota people is like kind of the classic image of Taiichi Ohno, and people would jokingly say, "Oh no, here comes Mr. Oh no," because he would yell and scream, and there are lots of stories about behavior like that. But Toyota seems to have evolved sort of, from that behavior like that might not be acceptable today, that that they've tried to evolve into what I've heard them describe as a more humanistic approach to how they improve and how they lead. So I think there would be danger in somebody saying, well, here's how Taiichi Ohno did it, here's how Shingijutsu people did it. Lean means yelling and screaming and insulting people like that. I wouldn't recommend that.
No, it's not nice.
No.
So, but it's like the U.S. Army approach. I try to break them down and then build them up again. But that may work in some settings, but absolutely not in all. We also have to remember that when, of course, Womack, Johnson, Roos, and the whole IMF study in the 70s, 80s, and 90s then studied this thing. They described the Toyota production system as of that day in 1988, 1989, 1990 in the machine that changed the world, right? And that's when we started to use the word lean. And that's a good study, and all of that is good. But at the second after that, I mean, in 1999, we started to populate the lean term with a lot of things that were never used in Toyota. Prime example is the value stream map. It's a good tool. It's a fantastic tool in many settings for consult. Doesn't work in all settings, but it isn't a Toyota tool. I mean, right? It's
an adaptation of what they called material and information flow diagram. Right.
Absolutely, and that plays another role a minor role in Toyota. So maybe that's an improvement of the Toyota production system, at least for some settings, but not for all. That's why I say lean isn't Toyota production system. Lean was Toyota production system in, when Kraftschick studied in 1988, he put out a study there on lean. That's when lean was TPS. Since then, it has evolved in slightly different directions, and. Lean, of course, is a much broader term than TPS. And we use lean in healthcare, in hospitals, in governance, in police. And nobody should tell us that it's exactly the same in all these settings, because it isn't true.
Yeah. And, there are things that evolve. And then there's some things that are old that are maybe timeless principles that don't change. Things like, a principle like respect for people, respect for humanity. Some of the manifestation of that may change over time, but the principle probably doesn't become outdated, right?
No, we all agree at that level. And then, of course, also this principle means different things in different cultures. slightly, right? And so it's and maybe I would like to make that point about then if you have a company-specific production system as well, it's just a guide. I mean, it's not a system you should rigorously implement, because sometimes these systems and programs that are adaptations of TPS to your setting tends to take on a life on their own, right? They are followed with a lot of assessments, and there's 20, 30 people working in a group just implementing and making PowerPoint slides and all kind of things to make these things look nice and shiny. Part of that is needed, but it shifts the objective from improving work itself to running these programs. And that's where we sometimes go wrong as well when we try to structure too much the deployment of lean, if you want to use that as a overarching.
There's deployment, and you've written about how, and I would agree with you on this, implementation is probably not the right word either.
Oh yeah, I used this word. I think it was back in was it Jeff Liker? I think I was in a conference with Jeff Liker, and I talked about him like informally about this, and I used the word implementation, and he stopped me and said that's not appropriate. But so he's thinking, kind of the idea is simple. Lean isn't the IT system. I mean, it's not a digital thing. You can't implement it. You're done. And okay, that was never my intention, obviously, with using this word.
Sure.
But reflecting on it further, I'm very relaxed about it, because okay, then what should we call it? Deployment? Is it better? What does it mean?
Adoption? I don't like.
That never ends. I mean. And particularly for a researcher, the word implement is almost needed, because we have to say something for sure whether or not you use it or not. I mean, we can't say, we're in there somewhere on the process, but we don't know exactly where. We need to be able to try to pin down approximately where you are, maybe even with a number. Otherwise, we can't do objective research on it. That has its limitations. We all understand it's not that easy and these things, but it's also what companies do with their assessments. So I'm relaxed about the word, but I've been arrested before for using it.
Back to that point of different researchers, maybe having a different view or different word. And I mean, hopefully, some of that difference sparks people to think and reflect and create their own experiences. But before we wrap up here, I do again want to point people to your blog, better-operations.com, and you can find links to journal articles that Tor has written. There's one, and maybe at some point we could do a whole episode around something you wrote about, and I've written and talked about why it's wrong to blame just in time. Quote unquote, just in time for pandemic era supply chain problems. Like, could you give us maybe just a real quick synopsis? If an executive, or if you were talking to an executive on an elevator, and they said, Tor, you say lean is good, but just in time has killed us during the pandemic. How would you try to explain?
Well, first I would ask you're not using just in time, because you probably don't know exactly what it is. I mean, if you have a global supply chain and these things, you already violating a little bit the principle of next door supply and these things. So that's one thing. And even if they have global, they usually tend to have tons of inventory in their supply chain. It was stuck somewhere. That's it. They don't know where it is. I mean, so they can use digital technologies and all kind of things to improve that performance. But so it's globalization, which I think it's a beautiful thing, is more to blame for the crisis that we got than just in time. And by the way, I hope we will go back to a time where we see globalization blossom again. Right now, it's a little bit of a dark time. I wanted to say one more thing. What was that? I forgot it.
That you're probably not really practicing just in time because you have big, long, slow supply chains. And then
and there was one more thing I wanted to say. If we want this to be a good planet to live on in the future, there is no other option than just in time. There is especially with the fragmented long global supply chains that we have, and we have them for a reason. It's because the economic activity always takes the shortest path, just like water. It finds its way, and it's a good thing. It's why the world has developed, and we are prosperous in these things. I'm not saying we should not have manufacturing activities in Western countries. We should, absolutely. It will always find its way. But cooperation and trade is a good thing in general. And if you're going to stock this world up with inventory everywhere, it's just not gonna be a good thing. Instead of inventory, focus on shortening lead times, and that is just very good Toyota thinking. So we're back to lean. Lean is saving the world.
Well, there's shortened lead times, which means more agility, lower inventory at the same time. But then there's the environmental impact and the carbon footprint, right? So I've seen Toyota at factories. I don't know offhand if they've achieved this. I know they certainly aim to be zero landfill facilities. So that's a pretty local way of looking at things. I wonder if the next step might be to aim to be carbon neutral through your supply chain.
That would be fantastic. Unfortunately, it's been free to pollute up to today. But again, here is an area where we should also embrace technology and not just say, because technology can do wonders if we are able to do things that reduce emissions. It can be anything from continuous improvement of engines to just make them more energy efficient. And it's not like they're not working on this. And then we also need to shift to new technologies. So there's a business opportunity that can actually be good for the world as well.
Yeah. Well, again, our guest has been Tor Netland. Tor, I'm really looking forward to meeting you in person and to seeing you, to hearing you speak at the AME Conference in Dallas. So again, I'll remind people, go to ame.org, look for a link in the show notes. And a final question, and maybe we can talk about this again in the future, that you have a textbook that you've written with Michel Baudin, who I know. He's a Frenchman who's lived in California for many decades, and I've crossed paths with him and respect his work. Tell us about that textbook and what the focus is, when it's going to be available.
That has been a long project. My God! If I knew when we started this thing, I don't know if we would ever start. But we're getting to an end 5 or 6 years after we started.
Oh, wow.
Which is much longer than what we had intended, but it is an 800-page textbook on introduction to manufacturing. You start to write about manufacturing, you realize there's quite a few things that you need to cover. And manufacturing is so diverse. There's so many different arguments you need to make. There's some boilerplate arguments about using some principles everywhere. It just doesn't work. So that's what has taken us quite a bit of time. It's a book with an industrial engineering and management perspective. And what it really does is that I think it fills a gap, because there's tons of textbook on operations management and supply chain management, taking the process perspective and explaining operation strategy and these things. They tend to be generic, good books to learn about these stuff, and there are many of them. At the other hand, there's all the machining process technology textbooks that go into grinding, milling, automation, and all of these things. In the middle there, how you manage actually design and improve a factory, there's been almost nothing. And that's exactly where we target the book. So I look forward to have that, see that. We've sent it to production. So now we're waiting for Routledge to, see how lean they are. So.
Well, there are, even in the best of times, publishing supply chains can be slow and global. There's another author I talked to recently whose book was Alan Robinson, who I'm going to have on the podcast again here soon. New book the release was delayed for a couple of months because he was told there were paper shortages, at least at his publisher. So. I hope you don't hit delays.
Maybe not, but there's also the ebook, so there's always opportunities with technologies that we can't ignore.
Well, it'd be an 800-page book is a lot to carry around, so there's a benefit to an ebook version of
maybe. Well, of course, there's something particular with holding a textbook in that.
Yeah. There are pros and cons as with any of these. new technologies. So we'll look forward to that book being available. Maybe when the book comes out, maybe you and Michelle and I can do an episode together to talk about
that. Could be fun. That could be fun. Yeah.
I have no good reason why I haven't invited Michelle to be on the podcast. So maybe we can do that at some point. So again, Tor Netland joining us from Switzerland, and he will again be at the AME annual conference as one of the keynoters. Website again is better-operations.com. Tor, this has been a lot of fun, and really, thank you for being here today.
Thank you. So see you soon.
All right, great.